This video will demonstrate the Chapter 5 Level 1 case. In this case, we are going to evaluate flat tax rates. So make sure you read through the information of the case. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead and open up, of course here, they give you an example, you're providing an example of what the case should look like when it's finished. Alright, so let's open up the Tacoma spreadsheet. And we'll enable editing here. And then go ahead and save it as Tacoma Tax Analysis as directed in Step 1. So let's look at what we're given here. We're given some different tables. Here's a table, and here's a table, and here's a table. And then we're going to be putting formulas to make this table populate. So each of those different tables, we can use the function VLOOKUP or horizontal lookup to calculate some information that the case is asking us for. Here we have in column B in this table, we have the taxable income for different groups of people. It actually is a taxable income. It says in the case that it's pulled from actual taxes that have been filed. Different states and the actual withholding that was paid and the estimated taxes that the taxpayer paid. And then this is the actual taxes that were owed at the time when they pulled this information. Okay, on step 2 of the case, it says in cell G12, so here's cell G12, they want us to write a formula that uses the alternate one flat tax rate to determine the total value dollar of the tax for the income in cell B12. So here we have a taxable income of $97,800, and using the alternate one tax rates, depending on the amount of dollars that are in here in the taxable income, we need to write a formula that will calculate that alternate flat tax rate. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use an H lookup. So the H just stands for horizontal lookup. Alright, we'll use our function. We're going to do equals H look. And when I start typing it, there I get the function right there. So I'm going to double click that because then it gives me clues on what I need to, how I need to build the formula. It gives me each piece separated by a comma on how I need to build this formula. Oops, I'm going to start that over. Okay, so we're going to do a H lookup. Oops. H look. If I just start typing the function, it brings in the formula for me. So I'm going to double click that. And here I've got H lookup, parenthesis, open parentheses and close parentheses at the end, and then it shows each of the different pieces of the formula that we have to put into it. So, and they're separated by commas. I'm going to do that again so I can make it just a little bit bigger here so we can see it better. Alright, here we go. So we've got our table here. I'm going to type equals H lookup. There's the function that I want. Let me move this down so we can see what we're doing here. Oops, that's not what I wanted it to. See if I can get that to move down. Alright, so what we're doing, we've got this table, this flat tax rate. Let me scoot this over so we can see it. So we have the alternate one tax rate and the alternate two tax rate. And you can see that in this case, it's going to want us to calculate the different tax rates for those different incomes that are listed here in this column. So which one do I want it to look at? So the first part of the formula, it says to use the lookup value. So I want this is going to be my lookup value, and so it brings in B12 right here, and I'm going to separate that by a comma, and then it says what table array am I going to use. So this is my table array right here. It's going to be from this B2 all the way to F4. B2 all the way to F4. And I'm going to hit F4 so I can turn that into an absolute value and anchor it. So right there it knows that we did that, and then we need to separate it with a column. And then it says what is the row index number. And so in this case the row of this column we're using H lookup. So we're looking at rows rather than columns. We're using rows, and I want it to be the second row of this column because I'm looking at just alternate one. So that's the difference between HLOOKUP and VLOOKUP. We'll see VLOOKUP in just a minute. So H refers to rows, because it's horizontal. V refers to columns, vertical. Alright, so B2 to F4, and I have to give it an index row index number. So I had said B2 to F4, and I want it to use the second row of that table. So remember, we used B to F, and the second row is right here. So I'm going to tell that I want to use row 2 of that table that I had just defined. Then we'll put a comma in there, and now I have to tell it, do I want an exact match or an approximate match? And in this case, we want it to be a And in this case, we want it to be an exact match, so we're going to put a 2 there, and then close our parentheses and hit enter. So we're not quite done with this. So what it did is we at this point we just told it to pick out the correct spot in the row that it's going to use that calculation. So this person on cell B12 has an income of $97,800. So what is the tax rate that has to be calculated for that person? And it's this, it's a 12.5%, and you can see that it returned that value. So I'm going to come up here into the formula bar, and I'm going to tell that to calculate. I'm going to add to this, I'm going to multiply that so I can get the actual flat tax times the income, and then I'll hit enter. So then we get this $12,225, and that is the tax rate. Alright, I'm going to double click here, and you can see that it copies it down into the table. The other way to copy is to grab that little thing and copy it down, the little dot in the corner. Alright, so I don't like the way that looks. As you all know, I've told you this before, I want to format those numbers with at least a comma in them. I need to highlight all of them, and then I'll come up here to the numbers group and tell it to be a comma. And I don't want any decimal places, so I'm going to decrease the decimals. So I just have a whole number. Alright, I hope that makes sense. Let's look at this formula one more time here. It's just the HLOOKUP, so we define the table as being this, and then we tell it we're going to use an HLOOKUP, so we're looking at rows, not columns. And then I want it, so I use B12 here, and then I define the table that I want it to look at, and then I tell it I want it to use the second row of the table. Here's row 1, here's row 2, and here's row 3. So that's what that 2 is there. And then the second 2 is that I don't want an exact match. And then I multiply that times B12. The reason I don't want an exact match is because when it's looking to the table for the income, I need it to be, it knows it's between 72 and 129, so I don't want that to be an exact match. Alright, so that should be pretty easy. I can do the flat tax alternate 2 the same way. Because I anchored this, I can go ahead and I can copy that formula across and just have to make minor changes to the formula. So I'm going to grab that and grab the little dot in the corner there and just copy it across. Now, I got an error because it doesn't really know what I'm doing. So I'm going to come up here. You'll notice it's B here. I need to retain all of that. Now I could have retained that if I had set this up differently, but at this point we'll just change it up here in the formula. So I'm going to come up here into the formula bar and change that to a B so that it's looking at B12 again, and this time instead of row 2 I want it to be row 3. Oops. So I can just edit the formula there to be a 3, and I still don't want it to be an exact match. And I still want it to multiply times B12, not C12, so I need to edit that too. So a quick way to just edit a formula and copy it across. So there it returned 14,670. Once again, let's look at that formula. The only thing I had to change, I still wanted it to calculate the taxable income on the alternate tax rate. So it took B12. And this time, instead of looking, and it used the same array, this is the table array, B2 all the way to F4, that didn't change, but instead of using row 2 of the range that I just defined, I'm going to use row 3. And then and then it will, if I take this off, we'll just check it. I'm going to take off times B12. We'll just check that, and you can see because the reason it's returning a 0 there is because I don't have enough decimal places in there. So if I come up here to my numbers group and increase the decimal places, you can see that it returns a 0.15. So that's, don't be shocked sometimes if that happens to you. It's just because you don't have enough decimal places showing. So that's how that worked. Sure enough, it worked. Pulled from row 3. Now I'm going to go back and edit that and put that times the B12 again. So I'm going to edit my formula up here at the top, and I'm going to put times, and then I can just click this B12, hit enter, and there we go. Now I really don't want it to have 2 decimal places, so I'm going to decrease those decimal places in the numbers group, and then I can just double click here and copy that formula all the way down. Alright, so that's that, and then we have the actual, let's see where we are in the book, just a second. Alright, so we just finished step 2 and 3 of the instructions, and we're on step 4. And it wants us to write a formula in cell I-12 that calculates the amount of unpaid taxes for each of the taxpayers. So I'm going to come up here to cell I-12, and I need to calculate the actual unpaid taxes for each of these taxpayers. So I'm going to just type equals F12. So here's the actual tax owed minus D12. So this was the actual withholding that was paid. This is what they actually paid on their taxes. So I need D12 plus E12. And then I'm going to close my parentheses. I need to put some parentheses in there so it calculates right. Let me edit that formula one more time. So it's going to be equals F12 minus, you don't necessarily need these parentheses, but I like to put the parentheses in because it just helps it helps you think about the order of operations. You always do what's in the order of operations first, and so when you put those in parentheses, it kind of defines that for you. Alright, if I copied that formula down, I'm going to hit enter, and I copied that formula down, I'm going to get some errors. Now it did some calculations, but they're not correct. Now it returned the answers correctly on this column, but if I try to calculate that across, I'm not going to get the right answer, and I'm going to demonstrate that to you. So I'm going to copy that over, and you'll notice that I get this minus 7,349. Look at the formula that I'm getting up here. Because I was calculating here to here, I have F12 minus this plus this. D plus E. So this minus this minus this. When I move that, copy that formula across, now it tried to move to G12, the alternate unpaid tax. G12 minus E12, so here I've got this, and F12. So see, it's not moving correctly. So the way that I do that, I have to anchor some pieces of that formula. So let's go back over here and let's change that formula. So all I really need to do is when I move across to this column, I need the D to stay anchored. I don't need it to move off of D. I don't need it to try to move to E and then try to move to F. I need it to anchor here. So I need to anchor the D up here in my formulas. So I'm going to put just a $sign in front of that. So I have a $sign D, and that's going to anchor the D but let it move down when I copy it across and down. And then the same thing on E. I need it to anchor E as well. So I'm going to put a $sign in front of E. So it will anchor the column but let the row move, and that's what I want. Alright, so let's just hit enter. It didn't change anything there, obviously, because we're just anchoring the cells. Now I'm going to copy that down. And you can see as I did that, all of those are now changed with the $signs in front of them. So now I can copy that across, and I should get the correct answer. So if I look at the formula, I can see that now I'm doing G12, I want it to calculate the unpaid tax alternate. So here's the flat tax. And then I still need it to take the flat tax minus this and minus this. So that just worked perfectly. So now I can copy that down as well. And I should get all of the right answers. Alright, if I look at this particular cell, I can see that it moved to column G, and it kept the reference of the row, it kept the reference of the column D and column E, but moved on the row. So that's how you use those dollar signs depending on how you want it to move. We've seen that before in other lessons. Alright, because of the way I created that formula here, I can copy that across to get the unpaid tax for the alternate 2. So I'm going to just copy that across. And when we copy that across, let's take a look at the formula. So I should be looking at H12, the flat tax, alternate 2, and I'm looking to see what is the unpaid tax on that, and I can see that it's using D and E. But it's moving it here on H for the alternate 2. So that's perfect. I'm going to just copy that down by double clicking, and I've got all of that. Alright, the actual penalty owed. So this is on step 5, and we need to calculate what is the actual penalty. So we have another table up here, and this is your penalty table, and we're going to use the VLOOKUP to use this table. Okay, so in step 5 of the case, it wants us to calculate an actual penalty owed. So here's the penalty table, and we're going to refer to this penalty table to determine if there's a penalty owed. So we need to define this table in the formula. So we could just define this every time we use it in the formula, but there's another way that we can do this. So I'm going to define this table, and it gives me a little hint. It says the range H3 to I8 is named penalty. So H3, so that's giving me my hint there, to I8 is going to be called penalty. So the way that I do that, it's already been defined because I've done this case before, but if I come over here, I can just type penalty here, and if you wanted to, we'll call it penalty tax, but just to have it do something different so you can see how that works. Now you'll notice if I use more than one word, I can't have any spaces in it. If I tried to put a space in there when I name it, it's going to give me an error that it's an invalid reference. So when I have this defined, I'm going to call it penalty tax. Now when you do it, you can just call it penalty like your book says. Alright? Alright, so, and then I just hit enter, and now that is defined as penalty tax. Instead of having to reference that every time, I can just type that into my formula. Alright, I'm going to show you a different way to do that this time. So this time we're going to use the function. I'm going to show you how to use this here. So I'm going to use insert function, clicking on that little function key, and I'm going to start typing VLOOKUP, and because I've used this before, it's right there. So I'm going to double click on that, and this is your function builder. So the first thing, it's going to walk me through this. So it says the lookup value, so I can click on the lookup value, and I need it to be I12 because it's, let me move this out of the way. Let's see, where can I move this? We'll move it right here. So let me scoot this all over a little bit so we can see what we're working at right now. Alright, so what I need is to give it the value that I'm wanting to calculate the penalty on. So I have actual unpaid tax. So if you haven't paid your taxes, you get to pay a penalty. So that's what I'm going to be penalized on, is not paying the correct amount of tax. So I'm going to click on that, and it puts it in the formula. Okay, now I need to tell it what the table array is, so that's the next part. So the table array is penalty tax. Alright, and it recognizes that. I could have pulled it down here as well. Not finding it, just a second. Let's see if we can do it that way. Not finding it there. That kind of messed things up. Let me just not do it that way. Alright, so I need my penalty tax. I'm going to do this again. Here's my actual unpaid tax. The table array is going to be, it's trying to build it here for me. I messed up. Let me start over. Let's do this again. Alright, I want VLOOKUP, and I can put my value. I can click on it. It's this. Then the second part is my table array, and I'm going to call that penalty. I'll just use penalty the way it is in your book. And then the column index number of this column, I have to tell it what number do I want it to look at. So it's looking at, if you don't owe anything, if you didn't have anything, you're going to have a 0 penalty. If you owe anywhere from $100 to $999, you'll have a 3% penalty. If you owe anywhere from $1,000 to $4,999, you'll have a 5% penalty. So the column index number that I want is the second column. I want it to calculate it based on this. So I'm going to put a 2 there. I can just type a 2. And then the range lookup, that's your range lookup. So remember, it gives you these hints right here. Is a logical value to find the closest match in the first column, sorted in ascending order. True or omitted will mean that it's true, or false as if you want an exact match. And so I'm going to just leave this blank because I want it to be, like it says here, I want it to, if I click on this range, it gives me on the last field here, true or omitted. I want it to go ahead and select that. So I'm going to click OK, and it returns a value of 0.07. Now, did it calculate correctly? Let's check. So I have an unpaid tax of $9,349. And so that's between $5,000 and $10,000, and it isn't more than $10,000, so it returns the value of 0.07. And it's doing a 0.07 because I haven't formatted that field to be a percentage. Alright, and that doesn't matter. So, and then I need to actually calculate the penalty. So I'm going to come back up here to the formula and multiply that times the actual unpaid tax. So I need this again. And then I'm going to hit enter. Alright, so now if I copy that formula down, look what happens. I'm getting some errors. And the reason I'm getting some errors is because I've got some negative numbers in here in the actual unpaid tax. So I need to redo this formula. And that's what the problem told you to do. It says to, in step 5, it tells you to use an if function to determine if the unpaid tax amount is negative. So we need to write an if statement as part of this formula. And we're going to, the if statement is going to say if this value is greater than 0, then use the penalty table. And if it's not greater than 0, then you're going to just return a value of 0. So we're going to embed an if statement into this formula. So I'm going to come up here and just modify my formula because this part of my formula is good. So I'm going to type equals, and I already have the equal sign there, equals if, and I'm going to put it in parentheses. So I'm saying if this value is, so I have if, my logical test is this value is greater than 0, is greater than 0. So here I'm using my little tool here. So the if, the logical test, is if this value is greater than 0, then I'm going to use the VLOOKUP. So that's how that works. And then I have to, in my if statement, I have to give it a value. What do I do if it isn't greater than 0? So over here I put a comma and then put a 0 here. I want it to return, if the statement isn't true, if the value is less than 0, what do I do? And I want it to just return a value of 0 to it. So I'm going to close my parentheses. So I have to use double parentheses in here. So we've got if I-12 is greater than 0, then I want the system to look at the VLOOKUP table for that value, calculate the penalty, and if it isn't greater than 0, then I want it to return a value of 0. So that should work nicely. Okay, well I got a value of 0, so something's wrong in my formula. It's good that I make these mistakes when I'm doing these videos so you can see how to solve it when it happens to you. If I come back up here into my formula, look what I did. I put if 12, I used the less than 0, and I need that to be a greater than 0. So I'm just going to correct that. It should be greater than 0, and now I'll hit enter, and I get my value there. All right. So that should work. That should work just perfectly. I don't need to put any sort of absolute values in any of that formula because it's just a relative cell reference. I want it to calculate it on each of these going down. I'm not trying to move over or do anything, so I don't need any absolute cell references in there. So I'm just going to copy that down. And you'll notice this one, it's less than 0, so it returns the value of 0, and that's because of my if statement. If the statement isn't true, then return a value of 0 is what that says. Alright, so now we just need to copy that across into column M and column N, and we'll have to make some modifications to make that work. So I'm going to copy this across, and we're going to make sure that we're referencing the correct information. So in this case, let's look back up our formula. We've got if J12, and we're looking at J12, the penalty, so it's moving across because I was using relative cell references. It's working just very nicely, isn't it? So here I am. I'm looking at this. Over here, I was looking at column I. When I copied the formula across, because I didn't use any relative cell references, it moved across and it changed the formula to J, which is what I want. And then when I look at this one for the alternate 2, it went ahead and looked at, and it's going to do the calculation for K, for column K. And you'll notice in each of those it updated the cell reference for everything. And that's what a relative cell reference is. It lets the program know that you want to go ahead and not anchor any of the information and let the formula move across. Alright, so I can copy both of those down. I'll highlight both of them and just copy them down. Alright, the last thing I'm going to do is just format all of these columns here so that they don't have any decimal places. So we're just going to reduce those decimal places to 0. Now step 7 wants us to use one more table. So we're going to see if there's any state tax allowance. And the state tax allowance in this case says it's to balance the high and low cost of living between different states. So here we have another table in our spreadsheet that is an allowance per these states: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Alright, so we need to write a formula that's going to look at that to see if we have any state allowance to lower the tax that we owe. So I'm going to use the VLOOKUP again and see if there's any allowance per each of those states. Now you can imagine why this would be useful. If you had a huge spreadsheet that you were working with, it would be very difficult and very time consuming to look at each of those factors one by one. So you write formulas and it does the work for you. So I'm going to use equals the VLOOKUP again. And this time I'm going to just do it this way. And I need to tell what value am I wanting to look at. So I want to look at the state. So here it is. C12 is where the state is referenced. I'm going to move this over so we can see this. So I've referenced C12, so there's the lookup value. And then I need the table array that I'm going to use. What table? So I'm going to put a comma in there because now I'm ready to use the table reference. So I need to go find that table. So here's my table. And in this case it's A7 to B9. So I'm going to just highlight that, A7 to B9. It's building my formula up here. I'm going to scoot this over so we can see it hopefully. I hope it turns out in the video. Sometimes it's weird how it scrolls across on these things. So I defined the table that I want to look at. I'm going to put a comma because I finished that piece of it. And then the column index number. And if we go back to that table, I want it return a value that's in the second column. All right, VLOOKUP as opposed to HLOOKUP, I'm using the columns. So the column index number is going to be a 2. And then I have to tell it, and then I put a comma again, so it goes to the next look, and I want it to be an exact match. So here you can see the difference between when we used the exact match or we used an approximate match. This time I want it to match exactly. So I'm going to choose that, double click it, close my parentheses, and hit enter. Alright, and it returned a value of 1100. Here's my formula. I'm looking at cell C12, which was, I think, Massachusetts in this case. Let's go look. It's Massachusetts. And so it returned a value of $1,100. Alright, let me scoot this down. Alright, I want that to do that for each one, and it says in the directions that if it doesn't match any of those, it's going to just put an NA in there. So I'm going to copy that formula down. Right, made a mistake again, so this is good. I wish I didn't make a mistake when I was making these videos, but good example to show how to fix it. So I did an anchor. When I was looking at, when I defined my A7 to B9, I forgot to anchor it. I don't want it to move. So I'm going to just highlight that A7 to B9, and I'm going to hit F4 and hit enter, and now when I copy that thing down it should work correctly. Alright, and sure enough it did. So we have Massachusetts over here, MA, it was an exact match, so it returned a value of 1100. Alright, so that, we have a couple more things to do with this case. It says in step 8, highlight in pink the column of the tax scheme that is the most favorable to the very high income tax earners. So if we come over here, we could write a formula for that, but we're just going to look at it. So if I look at these different tax rates, here's the actual tax owed, the flat tax, and the alternate tax. And here's the income of people. Well, here's somebody that has a pretty darn good income, $371,000. And what is the most favorable one to them? They've got this one, or this tax rate, or this tax rate. Which one is the most favorable? Well, this one is on that one. Let's look at another person that has a high tax rate. Here's this 292, and you can see that the flat tax alternate 2 is more beneficial to the high income taxpayers. Let's look at this one. This guy has 96,400. Here's your 19, it goes to 12, and here it goes to 14. So we kind of have to make a decision. Is that your highest taxpayers? Probably not. So I'm going to look at these two right here, and I'm going to determine those are the most favorable to people that make a certain income level. So I need to highlight that in pink. So I'm going to come over here to my Home tab and turn that I want it to be a pink. I'm not finding pink. We're just going to, I can use more colors, and let's see if we can get a pink here. Okay. Alright, so that took care of that. And then finally it says to format the worksheet to make it easy to read and understand. Alright, I think it's formatted good enough, but I think we left out one step. Alright, on step 6 it says in row 23, so here's row 23, we need to calculate the total values of each category, starting from F to N. So pretty simple. I'm just going to click on row 23 on the F column, hit my auto sum, and it's being pretty intuitive. That's what I want. I'm going to just hit enter to accept it, and then I can quickly copy that across all of the columns. I don't need it on the state allowance, that would be silly. And so here we have the total values all the way across. Alright, last thing that I would do, the book doesn't tell you to do that, but I would look at how this is going to print. If you wanted to look at this, how would you make this print so that it would be readable? So let's go and let's click on this. Remember, you can use your pull down menu and click on the print preview, and let's see how this thing looks. So here I have flat tax rate on page 1. If I click on page 2, there I'm seeing some different things there, aren't I? Alright. Not sure if I'm getting the whole thing there. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to define my print area. Make sure that I'm printing everything that I want. So I can come all the way down to here. I want this. I'm going to go to page layout, print area, and set my print area. Alright, we can see that it's doing this. I'm also going to go to page layout and do my setup, because there's certain things that I want to print regardless if it goes onto 2 pages. So I'm going to click on my page setup there, click on sheet, and I want it to repeat these rows at the top. I want these rows to appear on all of my pages that print. Alright, then the columns to repeat at the left, regardless of what page it goes on. I want it to repeat this information. Nope, I don't want that. Okay. I'm going to say columns to repeat at left, I don't want. And now we're going to just click OK. And then we're going to take a look at that in my print preview and see how that looks. Now if I go to page 2, I'm getting all of that information on there. Okay, when I look at this and I go to page 2 to see how it looks, I'm really not liking the way that looks. You'll notice that it's, I don't know if I can make this bigger, I can't. There we go. When I scroll between page 1 and page 2, you see how it's breaking up the table, which sometimes you can't help that. But I might be able to help it a little bit if I change to a landscape orientation. So let's see how that looks. So depending on who, I'm going to make that smaller, who you're presenting this to, could make a real difference on how you want it to print. So here, I'm still not getting all of it. I'm going to look at page 2 and quickly see, I have just a little bit of columns that are hanging over. So actually, because of the size of this table, I can probably do some scaling. So I'm going to click on scaling and I'm going to tell it to fit all the columns on one page. It's going to make it look smaller. When I'm doing work, sometimes I don't mind the smallness if I want to see everything on one page. I'm going to hit page setup and change my margins so I can make it just a little bit bigger. Oops, I'm going to make my margins smaller. And that will make it a little bit bigger. And one last thing I can do, because I have so much space here, I can spread that out a little bit. Now if you had a huge table, that wouldn't work as well. But I could spread out some of this information. So I'm going to click on here and I'm going to grab this. See how I'm grabbing between the 21 and the 22? I highlighted it all and I want to make those a little bit bigger. So I'm going to just make those like that. Now when I look at my print preview, it spreads it out a little bit more. We'll make it a little more readable. I could even do that some more. I'd still highlight it. I could grab any of those columns as long as it's highlighted and spread that out a little bit more. We'll go to the print preview. Now that's looking a little more legible, isn't it? And it's all fitting on one page. Alright, I like that. So, why don't you go ahead and save that. In your book it tells you to save it as Tacoma Tax Analysis and submit it for grading.